Can you guys see that?
Yes, we can.
Yes, you do.
Perfect. Okay, so yesterday we looked at NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and some of the critiques reflected the ways in which NGOs uphold and entrench dominant ideologies, drawing from Gramsci's theory of hegemony. But remember that Gramsci also believed that it is from the civil society space that a new strategy could emerge to dismantle the coercive apparatus of the state, to change the forma mentis, shape of the mind, and to challenge hegemony. So today our focus is on social movements. And why are they different from NGOs? Well, they are set up to challenge the status quo. Their membership is vastly different, mass mobilizations based on solidarity. There's less of the hierarchical organizational structures, not professionalized staffing as you would find in NGOs, or specific membership, specific ways of membership. And they are also supposed to have a common purpose for social justice as opposed to competing purposes. So again, I just want to draw from my experience here. So in my time at the Center for Civil Society, I've been really privileged to work with activists from, across the board, activists from major national campaigns and social movements like the Treatment Action Campaign, the Anti-Privatization Forum, the Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee, but also activists who come from far less resourced and less known movements. And the one thing that I've found that they have in common is that they are made up, the movement is usually made up of people most affected by what it is they are struggling against. So for example, someone who has a prepaid meter to access water and electricity and lives in a township situation. So someone who actually faces that daily struggle of getting water or lights cut off and not being able to correct it for the simple reason that that person just cannot afford to pay any more than he or she is already paying. Perhaps she lives off a pension and there's a certain amount that you can allocate to services. So that person in that household will then go without water or go without electricity. So people on the coal face who really experience these hardships and have not received the promise of a better life so many years into democracy, those are the people who are part of these movements, people who are actually impacted. And the other thing that struck me was the way in which these mobilizations work towards changing the status quo. So they're not afraid to kind of shake the foundations of everything as it is, and this is difficult in the context of South Africa, where there's still a number of different layers of loyalty to the ruling party, to the ANC, as the political party that brought freedom to South Africa, that liberated us from apartheid and the oppressors. And so there's still those loyalties. So it's difficult for, it's a difficult context to navigate if you have party loyalty, but yet you are still trying to pierce the dominant common sense with the good sense, right? So what I'm saying here is that I've experienced that there are significant sort of counter-hegemonic, it's a counter-hegemonic challenge, these mobilizations. So of course, they're not all the same. And of course, I don't want to be accused of romanticizing social movements. Yesterday, I told you that I've been accused of being an NGO hater, which isn't true. But on the same token, I don't wish to be accused of romanticizing social movements. So social movements are also fraught with all sorts of politics, with all sorts of power dynamics, with their own breed of challenges, right? So just to say that at the outset. Okay. So the definition slide, and you know why I have this slide, right? I did explain this to you in the first session. So I've drawn here definitions from sort of the gurus of social movement theory, Tilley, Tarrow, And I've drawn also from the Ballard work, Voices of Protest, which is quite a seminal work in South Africa on the new social movements. And we're going to talk more about the case studies from that work when we deal with South Africa in the 5th session. So social movements are a distinctive form of contentious politics. Contentious because if their claims are realized, they would conflict with someone else's interests. And political because governments appear somehow in the claim making. Social movements are defined as collective challenges based on common purposes and social solidarities in sustained interaction with elites, opponents, and authorities. So the emphasis is on contentious, on the idea of collective mobilizations and the common purpose. So I'm using this Jelen quote here: forms of collective action, social movements are forms of collective action with a high degree of popular participation, which use non-institutional channels and which formulate their demands while simultaneously finding forms of action to express them. So establishing themselves as a collective, as collective subjects. So the literature on social movements, you will find, distinguishes between old and new social movements. So the old social movements would include the labor or anti-colonial movements, and these were organized hierarchically with executive committees, for example, and used protest methods such as petitions, demonstrations, strikes. And the new social movements, dating from about the 1960s, from about 1968, the student revolutions in France, which was a rise in protest actions and political forms of organizations that were not aligned with political parties or trade unions. They were concerned with new issues, such as human rights, such as gender, such as the environment, and they reached beyond the borders of a nation. They operated within civil society at large, seeking transformation of social values, and they pioneered new forms of horizontal organization at grassroots level and network-based with new forms of protest. And these new forms of protest included using the media, using television, so radio, television. So in understanding social movements, we seek to understand who organizes. So who are these folks that make up social movements, right? Not just workers in the workplace, the site of struggle has expanded. So remember Marx's theory of surplus labor, of the proletarian class, where workers are exploited of their labor, from which owners of the means of production extract large profits. So this exploitation would be located in factories, in mines. The exploitation would be obvious. You would see as workers enter the factory gates or go down into the mine shafts. But this physical space also allowed them to organize, right? Organize for better wages, for more reasonable working hours, for better safety conditions. But what about people who are unemployed or precariously employed? People who are unorganized, those who Ashwin Desai calls the poors. And here he was referring to the poors of South Africa, and he was referring to people who are struggling against neoliberal policies that are not pro-poor. The multitude, those that Hart and Negri call the multitude, composed of different cultures, races, ethnicities, genders, different forms of labor, different views of the world. So this idea of the multitude captures the shifts in the global economy to reflect the expanding site of struggle, those who struggled against global capitalism and its effects. David Harvey builds on Marx's theory of accumulation when he argues that global capitalism accumulates through dispossession. So he talks about the dispossessed. That's one of your readings. It dispossesses people of their land, so people who are moved off their land when big corporates move in, perhaps mining interests. People who are robbed of their resources, such as water, when mining interests, for example, pollute water sources. People whose livelihoods are stripped away with patenting, for example, licensing seeds, when rivers are taken over from fishing villages and fishing communities, people are actually stripped of their livelihoods. They are dispossessed. So this has resulted in a number of struggles, excuse me, what Harvey calls militant particularisms. And examples would be movements against multinational corporations like Shell, such as the Ogoni movement in the Niger. The alliance of movements in India, which opposed land grabs by big corporates. The destruction of forests opposed by Latin American campaigns and social movements such as Via Campesina. So that's who is organizing. But now, why do people organize? Okay, so there are a number of reasons to organize. The first is expressing disaffection. So an example of this would be the famous Occupy Wall Street in 2011, where the financial district was occupied. This Occupy was inspired by the Spanish anti-austerity protests, and the narrative was 99% against the 1%. So this refers to income inequality and wealth redistribution in the USA. It was also known as a movement against social and economic inequality. So another example of disaffection would be the more sort of recent Greta Thunberg movement, Fridays for Future, where students skip school on Fridays in protest of the poor handling of the climate disaster. In 2014, there were 4,500 strikes across 150 countries. So and I'm pretty sure there were even some strikes that went on in South Africa. I know there were some in Cape Town. I don't know if there were any in Durban. I think there were some in Johannesburg as well, under this Fridays for Future. Another reason, claim making. So an example of this would be the Treatment Action Campaign that was claiming that medications to treat HIV/AIDS should be made available in South Africa in the public healthcare sector. And this is based on South Africans' rights to health, which is enshrined in the Constitution. We have social rights enshrined in our Constitution. And against this, they made the claim for ARVs to become available to everybody. And we're going to deal much more closely with the TAC in the 5th session when we look at South Africa. Seeking autonomy is another reason. So an example would be the Zapatista movement. This is the Mexican revolutionary group made up of indigenous people, which aligned itself with the anti-globalization movement. So the Zapatista movement didn't want to take power by force, but wanted to create a democratic space to do participatory bottom-up politics in a different way. And one of the ways they did this was by establishing their own municipalities, delegitimizing those that were set up by the state. Seeking autonomy. Another would be opposing the political, social, economic order. So examples of this would be the 1999, what came to be known as the Battle of Seattle. So this was the protests at the World Trade Organization, where massive street protests gathered outside the trade center. There was a crowd of over 40,000 people. They blocked entrances, they blocked routes going into the building. So the World Trade Organization regulates international trade. So they were made up of a loose coalition of networks, NGOs, social movements, religious groups, and they were advocating to stop the advance of the global corporate agenda and to prioritize the environment over this agenda, to prioritize consumer protection over this agenda. Seeking power is another reason. So an example of this would be the Cochabamba protests in Bolivia. So this was a campaign led by Evo Morales, a campaign for indigenous communities and protecting and promoting their rights to land, their rights to gas, because this was an area dominated by the big corporates. And these Cochabamba protests and this indigenous social movement came to power with Evo Morales as its leader. So the idea there was seeking power. And then finally, revolution, right? So a total change, seeking to totally change the system, eradicate the current system and replace it with another. And an example of this would be the Arab Spring, the wave of demonstrations and protests and riots in the Arab region, which began in about 2010, started in Tunisia, spread to Egypt, Libya, Yemen. People wanting to bring down repressive regimes, forcing rulers from power, basically opposing dictatorships, drawing attention and opposing the various human rights violation. And there were a number of ways in which this campaign spread, and one of those was social media. Okay, so what are some of the belief systems that drive social movements? Well, anti-imperialism, anti-globalization, the questioning of multinational corporations and whose interests they serve. So the power of the elites and the way that they are allowed to function, you know, all these loopholes around tax jurisdictions, misinvoicing, underinvoicing, you know, capital flight from Africa, for as an example. How are these forces allowed to operate in the way they do? And the result is that they dispossess large groups of people all over the planet, right? Another belief system, seeking equality under democracy. So here the idea would be equal access, but, you know, genuine access, not sort of tokenistic breadcrumbs, but an actual genuine access by everyone, for example, to healthcare, to decent, to a decent living wage, to decent housing, to dignified sanitation, to access to water, reasonable amounts of water. Feminism, so gender aspects, environmentalism, so rights to the commons, the rights of Mother Earth, social justice, so here, justice for those who've been dispossessed in the Harveyan sense, right? People who've had their livelihoods stripped away from them, justice for those people. Human rights as well as social rights, so social rights being access to health, being access to housing, access to water, and also racial justice, right? And, you know, often my experience of some of the social movements who are really trying to pierce the common sense with the good sense is that a lot of them are sort of underpinned by by the ideology of socialism, where they are wanting state control of resources, or they're advocating for more state intervention, in a sense that is the only way that's really going to fix things such as high levels of poverty, or reduce the great levels of inequality that, you know, we see around the world and in South Africa, certainly. Okay, so what are some of the tactics of social movements? So some of them work in the system, some of them work out of the system. By that I mean, some social movements will say, you know, I've interviewed activists and volunteers and members of social movements in South Africa quite extensively over the last decade. And you'll find that some of them are very, very clear about saying, we work in the system. So we are going to employ tactics that the democratic system allows us. It allows us to protest. It allows us to petition. It allows us to do marches down the main street. We're going to employ all of those tactics, and we are going to oppose the system that way, right? Or make our case that way. Others are a bit more ambivalent, and they are happy to resort to tactics that you know, the state or government will criminalize. So tactics such as reconnecting yourself to water or using izinyoka nyoka to reconnect yourself to electricity. So these sorts of quote unquote criminal, I'm putting them in quote marks, and we're going to talk more about these methods of protest in the South Africa session, so I won't go into it now, but I'm putting them into quote marks for a reason. These criminal activities would be seen as something that's out of the system. Protesting or using protest tactics or opposing tactics in invented or invited spaces of citizenship and ways of participating. We'll also talk more about that in a later session. So some of the tactics, okay, obviously protest. You would have all come across workers and student protest, trade union protest, student movement protest, but also community protest. So the kind of protest that you pick up your paper and read about every day, community protest in South Africa. What's also being called popcorn protest, because it rises up and then quickly dissipates and then rises up again somewhere else. But there doesn't really seem to be a link in terms of building a protest movement amongst these community protests. But they certainly seem to be happening everywhere for pretty much the same sorts of reasons. Okay. So resistance, so by resistance, I'm talking about resisting legislation. So for example, would be during the anti-apartheid struggle, when people resisted past laws, where, you know, during the Defiance campaign in 1952, people burnt their passbooks. They purposely went into areas designated white only. The same sort of thing happened in the USA during the civil rights movement, where people would occupy counters that were meant just for white people. So Black people couldn't sit at the counters, but they would occupy the counters as a way of defying or resisting legislation that they were opposing. The politics of shaming. Okay, so this is an interesting one. So this is a way to draw attention. You know, often governments, municipalities don't really want negative attention. So this is a good way of making them deal with the issue, right? So an example would be the poo protests in Cape Town. I don't know if you heard of those. So there was a thing where the municipality claimed that it was in partnership with the community to put in new bathrooms in an informal settlement. And the municipality came in, it put in the toilets, it didn't put up any walls or any sort of bathroom walls or bathroom structures. And they claimed that the community was supposed to have done this. So the protesters threw poo at politicians. They did this also at the Cape Town airport. So this was an interesting way to shame the Cape Town municipality, because that municipality in particular prides itself on, you know, foreigners, all the Swiss and the Germans and all those folks who they want to come and experience Africa, but then they also like Cape Town because it feels to them like, you know, the south of France or something. It's like our south of France. So it's Africa, but it's not really Africa. It's Africa on European terms. And I think that the Cape Town municipality, you know, really builds on that. So to embarrass them at the airport by throwing poo and urine in airport buildings was the politics of shaming, right? So, I mean, people have various opinions on this. Okay, everyday resistance is another tactic, or this is also, I'm drawing there a term from Scott, but Foucault also calls this counterconduct. So an example of everyday resistance would be reconnecting yourself to electricity once the municipality comes and cuts you off, or perhaps you've never even been cut off. You live in an informal dwelling and you just get izinyoka nyoka in to come and connect you to electricity, and then you access electricity. And in a way, you are resisting this idea that you should have to pay for electricity. And if you cannot pay for it, then you should go without. Okay. Another tactic that has been used very successfully by social movements in South Africa is the legal route, so legal processes. So an example would be Abahlali Basimjondolo's case in KZN to reverse the slum bill. So the slum bill would have, I can't quite remember what the actual bill was called, but it was dubbed the Slums Bill. So the Slums Bill would have given the municipality, eThekwini municipality, all sorts of powers over informal settlements and raising them and shutting them down, basically. And so this bill was, Abahlali Basimjondolo brought this to court saying that it was unconstitutional. Some of the ways in which some of the powers that the bill was giving municipal agents was unconstitutional because it deprives South Africans of reasonable access to housing and reasonable living standards. So that was successful. Another very well-known case, which we will talk about more later, is the TAC that brought the National Department of Health to the Constitutional Court, claiming that antiretrovirals should be made available to pregnant women in South Africa. So we'll talk, that was a very successful case. The court found for the TAC. The Department of Health was instructed to provide nevirapine to pregnant women in public healthcare facilities following that case. Legal process, international solidarity. So for example, the campaign for drug patents is something that was cross borders, grassroots mobilization. So this sort of tactic provides a conscientization process amongst at community level, at local level, also provides resources for people to mount their own campaigns or be vocal in their own right, in their own ways, on their own platforms. Okay. So, what are some of the ways that movements use spaces and symbols? We know that often spaces are used against them. So it's said that France pioneered the conscious use of urban design for political purposes, and I always find this so fascinating. In the 1850s, Paris was redesigned by Baron Haussmann to put in a new sewage system, to set up beautiful parks, train stations. And one of the main features of the new urban design was the replacement of the narrow streets and alleyways with spacious grand boulevards. The idea was to make it difficult for revolutionary Parisians to barricade streets. And these wide boulevards facilitated columns of French soldiers to march through and suppress revolt. So medieval Paris was converted to the pretty city of light that it is today, but this was one of the reasons for the redesign, to control dissent, to control collective mobilization and movements, right? So let's look at some of these other spaces. So this is Beijing. I'm sure that some of these images are familiar to you. Tiananmen Square. So this is 1989, a student-led protest backed by the 89 Democracy Movement. So there were 1 million protesters. They were calling for democracy. They were calling for accountability. They were calling for freedom of expression. The protest was, of course, suppressed by troops and tanks, and several hundred demonstrators were killed. And this square has been called the opposite of a public space. It dwarfs the individual. It's got this whole totalitarian feeling, dwarfs the individual. It's designed to make the individual feel subservient to the state. Space is better suited to parading troops and to showing off weaponry. Okay, this is Tahrir Square in Cairo. It was the site of the Arab Spring. And the reason that this is an interesting space is because it represents a shift. So demonstrations usually would happen in the Market Mosque complex following Friday prayers, and people would then mobilize from that space, from the market. But the Arab Spring mobilizations shifted into this nationalist space. where there's a statue of Omar Makram, who resisted the invasion of Egypt by France. So the symbolism of the public square, okay, even though the public square is built with European influence, but it's interesting how this space was used to mobilize and the way that it was linked with ideas of nationalism. Okay, this is Zuccotti Park in New York. This is the site of the Occupy Wall Street. So it's proximity to Wall Street in Lower Manhattan. It was estimated that there were like 500 people there during the day, during the time of the Occupy, and 250 people would stay at night. So Zuccotti Park was an interesting choice for the Occupy because it's privately owned public space. So the owners receive zoning concessions in return for creating and maintaining the space, but the park has to be open to the public 24 hours a day. So the police couldn't remove protesters. Protesters were allowed to stay there, and that's how they sustained the Occupy. Okay, so this is the Cacerolazo protest, the stew pot protest. I don't know if you would have seen this sort of protest, images of this kind of protest that go on even today. I mean, even during the lockdown, I saw an image of, I think it was maybe Brazil, people on their balconies banging on their pots. So it's a sort of well-used symbol of dissatisfaction in Latin America. So this is a protest in Buenos Aires in 2012 against economic policies. People were complaining about corruption. They were complaining about high inflation. And the banging of pots and pans has its roots in the 1971 Chilean March of the Empty Pots, where women marched denouncing Allende's socialist policies as causing food shortages and hunger. So it's interesting that this symbol has survived. I mean, it was very much middle-class women, right, affected by socialist policies. So upper and middle-class women. So it was a feminist march, but not really representative of poor women. So that's just one of the ways in which, you know, when you're looking at social movements, you have to be quite critical in terms of the, you know, who is mobilized, whose interests are represented. So I think that's one example. But the point that I'm making here is just the way that the symbolic banging of the pots has survived. Okay, the Yellow Umbrella movement in Hong Kong. So this was the pro-democracy movement. And this came about during the Hong Kong protests of 2014, resisting China, because China was restricting Hong Kong from choosing its own leader. So we know Hong Kong's got far bigger problems now. The umbrella was a symbol of defiance and resistance against the Hong Kong police. It's in this more sort of recent Hong Kong process, this yellow umbrella hasn't been used though. I think there was some contention around this, that what it was a symbol of. Okay, another one, the Sunflower Movement in Taiwan. So this was a student movement, and it was resistance against Taiwan's trade pact with China, the Cross-Strait Service Trade Agreement. Fears that Taiwan would be vulnerable to political pressure from Beijing. So the sunflower was a symbol of hope, and a hope for the students and the new generation that they would remain independent of China. This was a big concern. Okay, more recently, Black Lives Matter, and the interesting, and I'm not going to talk too much about Black Lives Matter now because we have a whole session on it on Monday. But it's interesting that this movement kind of hit the scene. I mean, it's been in existence for quite a while, but it hit the scene during lockdown, right? Using social media as a space. This hashtag Black Lives Matter carried far and wide. You would have seen people posting all sorts of things and hashtagging Black Lives Matter. So it's interesting how that this movement has hit the scene now during quite a repressive time of lockdown. But as I said, we're going to talk more about it. Okay, and then finally, I wanted to look at South Africa, fire and smoke in South Africa. So Kerry Chance wrote a paper a long time ago, and she said, and I think it was actually titled, "Where There Is Fire, There Is Politics." So a common feature of so-called service delivery protest is fire and burning, especially burning tires. So tactically, this will call attention to the protest. So nobody wants to waste their time protesting when nobody even notices they're there. So one of the tactics is to burn, to block a main highway, for example. Then people and the authorities are going to notice you. So the idea is to be disruptive, right? To make sure you are noticed. The second image is from 1985. It's of anti-apartheid protest. And you see, again, fire in the background. So I found out that fire had a very practical use. Smoke and fire had a very practical use. It was to counter the effects of tear gas. So if there was smoke and you were tear gassed, you were less likely to be affected by the tear gas, or it would counter the tear gas. I thought that was quite interesting. Okay, that's just by the way. Okay, so those are just some of the ways in which symbols and spaces impact on social movements, collective action, framing. We're going to talk a bit more about that now. So what have been some of the responses to social movements? So obviously repression. Police moves in, stops the protest. All sorts of interesting things around here. When I was doing research in Cato Manor organizers were telling me that when the police moves in, it's not even police from the area. So it would be police from a police station far away. So people who have no connection to you and who are able then to come in and repress. Another thing that protesters told me, which I thought was quite interesting and relevant, was that the protest was going fine. It was a peaceful protest until the police came on the scene, and then it turned violent. And then for some reason, the protesters were cast as the violent ones, when actually it was a peaceful protest. So there are some interesting things that happen around repression. Another one would be co-opting. So this is where also I've come across examples of this in Cato Manor, where local authorities would simply co-opt a movement leader and say, okay, let's give you a job here at the municipality and you can be the liaison with the community. So that's one way of kind of crippling the movement if there's a very strong and vocal leader, and also then being able to control how that leader frames the narrative. So it's not that you're not going to do anything about the problem, but you're going to do it on your terms as the municipality once you've been able to co-opt leadership and also then co-opt the narrative. And you can maybe tone it down a little bit, right? So you don't have to give everything, but you can give some things to try to deflect social discontent, right? And you've co-opted the leader, so you're in a stronger position to do that. You're in a stronger position to influence the people who are opposing you. Okay, criminalization. Okay, so this is common, criminalization of activists. Lots and lots of examples in our context where activists are arrested and cast as criminals, vandals, vagrants, when in fact it was a legitimate protest. There was a legitimate claim. Usually there is something, there's a process that happened before the protest. So protesters will tell you that they did write a memo. They did submit a memo to the municipality. The municipality never came back to them. When they tried to follow up, they were ignored. Or they were given all sorts of excuses. So protest follows that sort of frustration where you've tried to follow the processes, nothing's come of it, and so you then resort to protest, but you are then criminalized for it, okay? Sometimes the protest is social movement activity is legitimized. For example, when a political party formulates a campaign around a mass mobilization, an example would be the EFF around the right to land and its narrative of economic justice. Sometimes social movements and their mobilizations are viewed as a threat. So TAC activists told us a long time ago that because a number of TAC members were card-carrying ANC members and had in fact been part of the struggle against apartheid. So they were now opposing their former comrades. There was a sense of betrayal and a very clear sense of threat to the party by the social movement. So, yep, some of the responses viewed as a threat. Sometimes these mobilizations are just ignored by the media, and they're not featured, and so they don't have the traction that they could have, although there are victories in other ways, and we'll talk about that more later. Sometimes a response to a social movement is simply to delegitimize it. So something like, oh, well, that's not really representative of that community or that group. It's just some people causing trouble. It's just vandals, just some troublemakers, you know, that term troublemakers. Okay, so I know that I've talked a lot today and I'm nearly finished. I've got one last slide. So in your readings, you have a reading there that's like quite a theoretical reading, the one by De La Porta and Diani. And I just here wanted to introduce you a little bit to the three broad sets of factors used to analyze the emergence and development of social movements. So, you know, when we're looking at social movements, you can think about it this way. We are trying to understand the when, the how, and the why of social movements, right? When do they come about? How do they come about? And why do they come about? Okay, so the first, you'll hear about these theories: political opportunities, mobilizing structures, framing processes. Okay, so the first, political opportunities. Movements are understood within the broader set of political constraints and opportunities in the context in which they are placed. So the openness or closure of the institutionalized political system, the state's propensity for repression, okay, so that will affect levels of protest, for example, or perhaps it won't. Perhaps when there's more repression, there's more protest. The degree of stability, instability of political alignments, the availability of allies. So these are all factors that will impact on when social movements come about, like when is the optimal time to mobilize. So take, for example, the rise of social movements in the 2000s in South Africa. We had a new democracy and there was now this democratic space to mobilize. Similarly, the rise of social protest around the time that Jacob Zuma came into the presidency, because people believed that he was more of a people's person than Thabo Mbeki, and that it was likely he would take more notice of them. So it was a good time to protest. So what's happening? What are the political opportunities that allow for these collective mobilizations? The second, mobilizing structures. So the formal and informal collective vehicles through which people mobilize, right? So through which people engage in collective action. So this would be organizational aspects of the movement, how they mobilize, how are they organized, what sort of tactics do they employ, the material and non-material resources they have. Okay, so do they have money? Do they have services? Do they have networks? How are they organized? So to give an example of the Treatment Action Campaign, it may have had at any given time sort of a certain amount of paid up membership, but it could mobilize triple or quadruple that when it called a protest. So it was able to mobilize in large numbers across networks. And the TAC also, sorry, may I ask everyone to mute their mics? Thank you. So the TAC is also adopts this idea of self-mobilizing. It's a specific tactic that they use where they conscientize people at local branch level to self-mobilize. So don't wait for the TAC to come in with a campaign about ARVs, about rights of pregnant women, about whatever the issue of the day is, access to vaccines, that's coming up, right? And we know that the TAC is going to be on it, equitable access to vaccines. Don't wait for the TAC to come in find your own voice and be a community that's able to articulate these concerns immediately, and in the channels that you've been introduced to through the TAC. So if the TAC were to die tomorrow, community mobilization would still be active. It would be ingrained in the nature of that community. So that's what they mean by self-mobilizing. Okay, framing processes. So that's the why, the way, the meanings and definitions that account for collective action. So basically, it's the way movement participants fashion shared understandings of the world. How are social problems identified as objects of collective action? How do social actors come to develop a sense of commonality? So a sense of the we, right? So the Anti-Privatization Forum in South Africa which is another social movement we're going to look at in the South Africa session. The APF demobilized owing to a failure to forge this collective identity, right? So there were people who wanted to employ certain tactics and oppose privatization. And then there were certain people who at the time were saying, well, President Zuma has just come to power. He's more likely to be understanding of our needs. We want to give him a chance. No, we definitely don't want to do that. That's too disruptive. We don't want to show disloyalty to him. So there were difficulties in forging that collective identity. And it's one of the reasons that the APF demobilized. Okay, I am going to leave it there.